The lanterns of Thorne Hall were burning with a brilliance that Savannah would talk about for decades. Everything was flawless. The 300 whale oil lamps were lit in perfect sequence. The scent of fresh jasmine hung heavy in the midnight air, and not a single silver spoon was out of place. It was the crowning achievement of Clara Sterling's career as a housekeeper. The problem wasn't the ceremony. The problem was the Major. Standing at the altar in his dress uniform, Silas Thorne wasn't looking at the heiress walking toward him. He was looking at the shadows, straight at the invisible woman holding a ledger behind a stone pillar. And in that one stare, Clara realized the most dangerous plan she'd ever written was about to go up in flames. Clara Sterling had spent her entire life mastering the art of the vanishing act. In the high-stakes parlors of Savannah, where a misplaced word could ruin a reputation and a cold soup could end a career, being invisible wasn't just a preference, it was a survival strategy. 6 weeks ago, when the commission arrived at her small boarding house near the docks, she had read the invitation 3 times. It wasn't just any event. It was the Thorne-Vance Union, the wedding that was supposed to cement the political future of the territory. Silas Thorne, a man whose reputation for stern efficiency was as sharp as the crease in his major's uniform, was asking for her, not because she was a socialite, but because she was a ghost who could move mountains. Clara accepted, of course. For 6 weeks, she became a shadow in Thorne Hall. She measured the fall of the velvet drapes in the ballroom to the exact half-inch. She calculated the burn time of 300 whale oil lamps so the light would reach its peak just as the governor entered. She lived in the margins of ledgers and the steam of the kitchens. Her only constant companion, the silver-nibbed quill tucked habitually behind her ear. She used her perfection as a shield. If the lace was flawless, no one would look at the woman who pinned it. If the schedule was seamless, no one would ask about the housekeeper who wrote it. It was the brick wall syndrome, a strange, psychological phenomenon of the working class. When a system runs too perfectly, the people within it forget the heart that beats behind the machine. Clara was so good at her job that she had become part of the architecture. To the guests, she was as functional and as nameless as a well-placed chair. But Silas Thorne was a man of logistics, and logistics required observation. In the first week, Clara had been kneeling on the floor of the grand study, measuring the gap between the mahogany desk and the window for a floral display, when a pair of polished boots appeared in her line of vision. "The light in here is too harsh for magnolias, Miss Sterling," he had said. His voice was like the low hum of the Savannah marsh at dusk, steady and deep. Clara hadn't looked up immediately. She adjusted her ruler. "Which is why I've requested jasmine, Major. It thrives in the shade and its scent carries better in the evening humidity." There was a silence, not an awkward one, but the kind of silence that happens when someone is truly listening. Clara finally looked up, and for a second, the cool morning air in the study felt strangely heavy. Major Thorne wasn't looking at the maps on his desk. He was looking at the smudge of ink on her thumb. "Efficiency is one thing, Clara," he murmured, his blue eyes narrowing slightly as if he were solving a complex equation. "But you handle this house as if you're afraid it might break if you stop watching it. You've been working since 4 o'clock this morning. Sit." "I am a housekeeper, Major. I'm paid to watch, not to sit." "You're a person, Clara. That's not the same thing." She had retreated into her ledger then, hiding behind a list of imported wines and seating charts. But the heat had already started. It was a faint, inexplicable warmth that radiated from her chest every time he entered a room. She blamed the Georgia sun. She blamed the friction of the silk she was steaming. She blamed everything but the terrifying truth, for the first time in her life. The brick wall she had built around herself wasn't keeping people out. It was being dismantled, stone by stone, by a man who saw the woman behind the work. In the 3rd week, the planning meetings shifted. Usually, these sessions were a tedious dance of silk swatches and silver patterns. A checklist of bridal vanities that Silas Thorne would endure with a polite, distant nodding. But by Tuesday afternoon, the swatches were gone. In their place, spread across the massive mahogany table in the Thorne Hall study, was a surveyor's map of Savannah. Clara had brought it. Not because it was her job, but because the logistics of moving 400 guests through the city's narrowest cobblestone arteries required more than just intuition, it required a strategy. She stood by the desk, her silver-nibbed quill poised, her fingers trailing over the ink-etched lines of the riverfront. The bridge at the eastern crossing won't hold the weight of the carriage procession, Clara said, her voice professional and crisp. The foundation pilings have settled since the last heavy rains. If you send the wedding party over that route, the delay won't be minutes, it will be hours. Silas didn't look at the bridge. He looked at Clara. He leaned over the map, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the paper. And for a moment, the air in the room seemed to tighten. The city surveyor's report said the bridge was sound, he noted, his tone a low, steady challenge. The city surveyor hasn't been under that bridge in 3 years. Major, she replied, her gaze never wavering. I checked it myself yesterday morning. I've adjusted the route in red ink. It adds 2 miles, but it ensures everyone arrives before the sun sets. Silas Thorne was a man of action, a leader who had spent a lifetime reading men on the battlefield and politicians in the parlor. Most men in his position would have been offended by a housekeeper correcting a public record. But Silas was different. He possessed what few in the Savannah elite could claim, a strategic empathy. He didn't just see a woman holding a quill, he saw a mind that functioned with a terrifying, beautiful precision. It was the ultimate form of sapiosexuality, an attraction built not on the curve of a smile or the lace of a dress, but on the undeniable weight of intelligence. To Silas, Clara was the only person in the Vance Thistle ballroom who wasn't performing. She wasn't a diamond to be displayed. She was a partner who understood the machinery of the world. You don't just plan events, Clara, he murmured, his blue eyes intense as he traced the red ink she'd laid down. You manage risks that most people aren't even aware exist. I manage reality, Major. It's what I'm paid to do. Reality is rarely this well organized, he countered. He straightened up, his presence filling the space between them until Clara felt that familiar, blooming warmth in her chest, that heat that had nothing to do with the humidity of the Georgia afternoon. Most leaders look for loyalty. I look for the person who isn't afraid to tell me when the foundation is rotting. The foundation, however, was rotting in more ways than one. Late that night, while cross-referencing the Vance estate's contributions to the reception budget against the local merchant ledgers, Clara's quill stopped. The numbers didn't move like they were supposed to. There were gaps, hollowed-out spaces in the Vance family accounts that suggested the dowry Beatrice was bringing wasn't a fortune, but a debt. Lord Vance wasn't marrying his daughter to Silas Thorne to create an alliance. He was doing it to hide a financial collapse. The wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a liquidation. Clara sat in the dim light of a single oil lamp, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the red ink on her ledger, the marks of her own honesty. In the world of high society, a housekeeper who found a lord's secrets was a housekeeper who disappeared. She could stay quiet. She could let the perfection of the ceremony mask the rot of the contract. That was the professional choice. That was the safe choice. But as she looked at the maps they had pored over together, she realized that Silas Thorne wasn't just another client. He was the only person who had ever looked at her and seen more than a shadow. The warmth in her throat felt like a held breath. She knew then that she couldn't just plan his wedding. She had to save his life. The night before the ceremony, the air in the Thorne Hall gardens was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the damp, heavy heat of the Georgia marsh. Clara stood by the iron trellis, her fingers tracing the edges of her leather ledger. She was checking the placement of the perimeter lanterns for the 10th time, her mind a whirlwind of schedules and contingencies. But for once, the ink on the page seemed to blur. The governor's carriage is scheduled for 8 o'clock, she whispered to the shadows, her voice a fragile anchor in the dark. If the humidity holds, the candles in the pavilion will need to be replaced every 2 hours to prevent wilting. The governor is the least of my concerns tonight, Clara. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. The warmth reached her first, a steady, radiating heat that seemed to cut through the midnight chill of the stone path. Silas Thorne stepped into the light of the lone garden lantern. His uniform jacket unbuttoned at the neck, his expression unreadable. "Major," she said, her voice shifting back into the professional shield she had worn for 6 weeks. "You should be inside. The final briefing with Lord Vance is—" "Lord Vance is a liar," Silas interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a gavel. "And the alliance he's selling is a hollow shell. I've read your notes, Clara, every red-inked correction, every missing figure you found in his accounts." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She finally turned to face him, her knuckles white as she gripped her ledger. "Then you know the Vance estate is insolvent. If you call off this wedding, the governor will withdraw his endorsement. You'll lose the mayoralty, your career, the future of Savannah. It all rests on that altar tomorrow." She took a step toward him, her gaze urgent. "Silas, go back inside. Marry Beatrice. I've organized everything to be perfect. No one has to know about the ledgers. You can build the city you want from the seat of power. Even if the foundation is a lie, don't throw it all away for the sake of an honest housekeeper's report." The silence that followed was long and suffocating. A night bird called from the oaks. Silas took a step closer, and the warmth Clara had been fighting intensified, pooling in her hands and settling at the base of her throat like a held breath. "Is that what you think I want?" he asked softly. "A throne built on rot? A life spent looking across a dinner table at a woman who is merely a political decoration?" "Beatrice is a diamond," Clara countered, her voice trembling. "She is what Savannah expects. I am just the woman who ensures the lights don't go out." "Diamonds are common, Clara. They are hard, and they are cold, and they are everywhere in this city." Silas reached out, his hand stopping just short of her face, the heat of his palm making her skin flush. "I don't need a queen for a ballroom. I need a partner for a revolution. I need the mind that saw the rot when everyone else was blinded by the gold. I need the woman who argued with me about bridge foundations until 2 in the morning because she cared more about the truth than her station." "You'll lose everything," she whispered. "I'll lose nothing that matters," he affirmed. "Let them take the office. Let them take the title. I would rather build a city from the dirt with you beside me than rule a kingdom of ghosts alone. Savannah doesn't need another wedding, Clara. It needs the truth." The warmth Clara had blamed on the lamps and the Georgia summer finally boiled over. It wasn't just a physical sensation anymore, it was a revelation. For years, she had planned beautiful things for people who never bothered to learn her name. She had built her life around being invisible, believing that her value was tied to her silence. But looking into Silas Thorne's storm-dark eyes, she realized the wall was gone. He wasn't asking her to be a housekeeper. And he wasn't asking her to be a bride. He was asking her to be seen. "The ceremony," she breathed, her mind already racing through the implications. "The guests. The governor is already in the East Wing." "Let them wait," Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I've spent my life following orders. Clara, tomorrow, for the first time, I'm following the ledger." The morning of the ceremony arrived with a stillness that felt like a held breath. Thorne Hall was a masterpiece of symmetry. The 300 lanterns cast a golden glow against the polished mahogany. The white magnolias were arranged with mathematical precision, and the velvet ribbons of midnight blue draped from the balconies in perfect arcs. Every detail Clara had spent 6 weeks obsessing over was exactly where it belonged. The problem was the silence. As the processional music began, Clara retreated to her usual spot behind the oak pillar in the east wing. Her ledger pressed tightly against her chest, the silver-nibbed quill still tucked behind her ear. She watched as the doors swung open and Lady Beatrice Vance entered. She looked like the very definition of Savannah royalty, a diamond draped in ivory silk and heirloom lace. But as Beatrice walked down the aisle, her pace wasn't that of a woman walking toward her future. It was the steady, deliberate march of a woman walking toward a battlefield. Beatrice reached the altar, but she didn't take Silas's hand. Instead, she turned toward the governor, her father, and the 400 shocked guests. "For 18 years, I have been the jewel in my father's crown," Beatrice said, her voice carrying through the hall with a terrifying clarity. "And today, I was to be the currency he used to pay off his debts. But Savannah deserves a foundation built on truth, not on the hollow promises of a man who has gambled away his estate and his daughter's life." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Lord Vance's face turned a violent shade of crimson. But Silas stood perfectly still, his blue eyes bright with a sudden, sharp respect. Beatrice turned her gaze toward the pillar where Clara stood half hidden in the shadows. "Every plan you see here today, every light that burns, every map that has been redrawn to save this city, was not my doing," Beatrice continued, her smile widening with a fierce, quiet pride. "It belongs to the woman who actually knows the weight of our ledgers. The woman who has been invisible for far too long." Beatrice stepped to the side, a gesture so simple yet so monumental it felt like the shifting of an empire. She looked directly at Clara and whispered, loud enough for the warmth to bloom in Clara's chest one last time, "Choose your own light." "Clara, I'm choosing mine." Clara's heart hammered so hard it felt like it might shatter her ribs. She looked at Silas, and he was already moving toward her. He didn't wait for her to come to him. He crossed the distance of the hall. Ignoring the whispers of the elite and the glares of the council, he stopped in front of her, his hand held out, palm up, an offering, not an order. "I told you I didn't need a queen for a ballroom," Silas murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I need the woman who isn't afraid to tell me when the world is rotting. I need you, Clara, not because of a contract, but because you are the only person who truly sees Savannah, and the only one who truly sees me." In that moment, Clara realized that Beatrice's withdrawal wasn't a defeat, it was an act of supreme defiance. Beatrice had written Clara a silent letter of liberation. She had looked at the golden cage of her high society marriage and realized that by stepping back, she was finding her own path to freedom, leaving the throne to the only woman who actually knew how to run the kingdom. Clara set her ledger down on the stone ledge. The leather was worn, the pages filled with red ink and hard truths. She took Silas's hand, and the warmth didn't just pool in her throat, it exploded through her entire being. The lanterns seemed to glow brighter, reflecting the light of a plan that was no longer about disappearing, but about finally, irrevocably, being found. 3 months had passed since the lanterns at Thorne Hall sparked a revolution in the heart of Savannah. The dust of the scandal had settled, but the air in the city felt different, sharper, cleaner, as if a long overdue rain had finally washed away the soot of the old guard. Clara Sterling sat at the heavy mahogany desk in the mayor's private study, the morning light streaming through the tall windows. She wasn't checking the thread count of linens or the ripeness of the peaches for a gala. She was reviewing the territorial grain subsidies. Beside her sat a cup of tea, brewed strong with a hint of honey, exactly how Silas had learned she liked it during their second week of marriage. The silver-nibbed quill was no longer tucked behind her ear, it was in her hand, moving with a terrifying, rhythmic precision across a stack of official ledgers. There was a certain justice in the sound of the nib scratching against the heavy parchment. For years, Clara had been the woman behind the curtain, the invisible force ensuring that beautiful things happened for people who didn't know her name. But now, that invisibility had transformed into a different kind of power. There is a quiet truth that the councilmen of Savannah were beginning to learn. A woman who can coordinate 400 guests, 300 lamps, and 12 courses without a single drop of spilled wine is a woman who can dismantle a fraudulent budget with surgical ease. Clara didn't bring floral arrangements to the table anymore. She brought the art of the logistical strike. When she pointed out a 40% discrepancy in the harbor's dredging tax, it wasn't a guess, it was the result of a mind trained to notice every fraying edge and every misaligned candle. In the halls of power, men usually feared the loud or the wealthy, but now, they feared Clara's red ink. The door creaked open, and the familiar warmth reached her before Silas even spoke. It was a constant heat now, steady like the embers of a well-tended hearth. "The Board of Trade is complaining again," Silas said, leaning against the doorframe, his major's uniform replaced by a simple linen coat. He looked at the ledgers spread across her desk and smiled, that quiet, intent focus that still made her pulse quicken. They say the new auditor is unrelenting. The Board of Trade alphabetized their receipts by the first name of the merchant. Silas, Clara replied, not looking up as she made a sharp correction in the margin. They didn't need an auditor. They needed a housekeeper. Silas walked over and set a fresh pot of ink on the desk. He didn't say it was a gift, but they both knew it was. He watched her work, his presence a silent anchor in the room. He had traded a political alliance for a partner who could see the rot in the foundation. And every day since, the city had stood a little taller. You know, he murmured, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, the heat of his palms seeping through her dress. I hired you to plan one evening. I ended up with a strategist, a logistics commander, and the only person in this city who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Clara finally looked up, her blue eyes bright with the satisfaction of a plan finally perfectly executed. I believe that's called exceeding the brief, Major. She picked up her quill and went back to the ledgers. She was no longer hiding behind stone pillars. She was the one holding the ink. And for the first time in the history of Savannah, the numbers finally added up. Clara Sterling had spent years believing that her only value was in her silence. She thought that if she planned perfectly enough, if she measured the shadows and the light with enough precision, she could remain safely tucked behind the heavy oak pillars of other people's lives. But as she watched the morning mist lift over the Savannah River, she realized that you cannot build a life around the art of disappearing. For so long, she was the one who lit the candles so others could shine. She was the woman who ensured the world was flawless, only to retreat before the applause began. But looking at her reflection in the silver-nibbed quill on her desk, she finally saw the truth. The warmth she had been feeling wasn't just coming from Silas Thorne. It was coming from the realization that she was no longer a shadow in someone else's ballroom. Love didn't just save her from the darkness, it acted as a mirror, showing her that she had always been the brightest light in the room. You don't have to stay invisible to be safe. You don't have to be a diamond to be precious. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is set down your ledger. Step out from behind the pillar, and realize that you were always meant to be at the center of the plan. Don't just light the way for others. Be the flame. Don't just build dreams for the world. Ensure that in the grand design of your own life, you are the one standing in the light. Because the moment you decide to be seen is the moment the world finally starts making sense. You are here, and you are worthy of being found.